Approachability.
Ensure that everyone has something to say.
Ensure that everyone who has something to say can say it, right?
Participating in creating a diverse workforce.
Participating and creating a diverse workforce.
I was going to say create psychological safety or fairness.
Create psychological safety, fairness, and so forth, right? Drawing off strengths, exactly. So let's look here. Now, you saw this. I'm going to walk through the slides, and I'm going to ask you questions as I go through it. So if I don't get everyone's comment as I go through, I apologize for that, but I just want to get through these. This is the framework, right? You saw that. This is the Global Diversity and Inclusion benchmarks. At the bottom of it, what do you see? Drive the strategy, right? Three things: vision, leadership, and structure. An inclusive leader is someone who helps drive, provides leadership, and who sets and organizes the work and provides the resources, right? So let's take a pause here and talk about what's happening here in America today. Have you observed any inclusive leaders in this issue, this controversy about kneeling before the flag? Let's bring it home. A lot of debate there. Who would you describe as an example of an inclusive leader in the last week?
Kaepernick.
Kaepernick?
Yeah.
Okay, tell us about why you think so.
Well, he did this like over a year ago, and he's remained, very vocal about why he did it around racial injustice.
He did it a year ago, and he has remained forefront of this. Yes?
Shannon Sharp.
Shannon Sharp. Tell us why you think Shannon Sharp.
He took the message that people were misconstruing, and then he told them the reason that Colin Kaepernick and many of the other athletes shouldn't do it, and he was clearing it up. And the fact that he's on ESPN First Take, and that he was doing it on like the biggest sports platform, and he kept just reiterating it.
Great, thank you, thank you. Any other thoughts?
Greg Popovich.
Ray Popovich? Tell us why.
He's a recognized leader. He's a recognized coach. He is a recognizable figure, and he spoke openly about why this issue exists. He spoke openly about why there is racism and hate against the people that are kneeling. He spoke also about the terms that the media were using and that some of the separatists were using in terms of like they should be grateful, and what that actually meant, that it was a term for racism, or it was another code word, that all those types of things. So I think that was a demonstration of inclusive leadership.
Great, thanks. One more, and then we'll go, George.
I was going to add on to the Greg Popovich one. He's an NBA coach. He's white. He talked about white privilege in the course of his comments. And then he's also a graduate of the Air Force Academy, which kind of brought someone who had a military background coming out and talking about the issue in a sophisticated way.
So he brought some ideas and thoughts from his background. Just.
I was thinking about actually maybe not. It's like a kneel specifically, but like the allyship that has come out in the last week of just a lot of the people that come together to support their players or their as teams and organizations in that space.
Mm-hmm. They brought their teams together. They rallied their workforces or the teams of the people that.
Well, whether it be like the owners or the coaches or
right.
just organizations that kind of came for allyship in this space.
So allyship and so forth. Right. So inclusive leaders are change agents in organizations, right? Change is a multi-year, long-term proposition. It just isn't about an event. It's about a journey, and it's about the things we do to make a much more inclusive climate and culture in organizations. But inclusive leadership occurs in the context of culture. So I want to ask the question, and And the context of culture drives leadership mindsets. Anyone want to take a gamble about what that really means? That statement, the context of culture drives leadership mindsets. Yes?
Well, there was an ex-head coach, NFL head coach by the name of Coach Ryan, who used to coach for the New York Jets and also the Buffalo Bills. And he had come out a couple days ago to speak out against the current president for the statement he made toward NFL players who take the knee during the anthem, calling them sons of bitches, that the owner should fire them. So the context is that we have the highest, most powerful role and position in the world, making a direct, contextual, disparate remarks on players who are trying to address the issues of disparity and inequity. At the same time,
to really drive that. But one of the things I'd like to start in terms about inclusive leadership is role modeling. Inclusive leaders model the way forward and create a sense of belonging. Anyone want to comment on what you think that means? When model the way, what does that mean?
Go first.
Go first. Okay. What else?
What he brought up, active listening. I mean,
Active listening, okay. Modeling, which then creates a sense of belonging. What is this sense of belonging? There are a lot of organizations today that are working on this concept of belongingness. What's that all about? Anybody?
The inclusion piece.
The inclusion piece?
what you do matters.
Feeling safe, what you do matters?
To me, I guess it means never having to ask that question, do I belong?
Never having to.
Intentional behavior and also being very deliberate in your behavior. You influence the people that you lead. And you need to be mindful of that. And at bottom line, all people want to feel valued and respected. But you need to be authentic, very genuine. And you can communicate that to people by listening. I mean, it goes back to active listening, engaging them, building their strengths, building through people, not over people. When you take a look at our millennials and also Generation Z, been in the workforce.
But any other comments or thoughts? I'll move on. Yes?
Vulnerability. I think a leader has to also be willing to admit that they have some areas where they need to grow.
Vulnerability, to be able to admit that you don't know it all. There's some areas of opportunity and growth that you need to really focus on as well as a leader, and to be able to ask for help and support. We did some of that, again, when I did some early work at warehouses where leaders thought they do, and oftentimes when you're a fairly senior leader in an organization, it's not easy to admit that you don't know something, right, to the organization. So it's very important to be an inclusive leader. You really have to weigh into or lean into that discomfort. Yes?
One thing no one's mentioned is standing behind your employees, behind your staff, and just supporting them and protecting them.
Standing behind your employees and your staff and supporting them. Exactly. So I'm not going to go into this, but this was just a framework that I put together in terms of critical leadership competencies with respect to D&I or inclusive leadership, and I would characterize 4 areas. There are foundational areas that really talk a lot about, just demonstrating a high level of professionalism, change management, really being aware of and knowledgeable about change processes and organizational effectiveness models and so forth. It's not enough to schedule a series of events. You really need to think about this as a change process that takes years, and putting together the plans, the actions, the priorities, the metrics that will guide kind of how well you do there. The organizational capability, understanding where your organization is in terms of how they think about D&I. Not every organization is as knowledgeable or as educated, about what to do. And so some organizations may be in very early stages of understanding what to do. Others may be much more advanced. The Bernstein, who works at Deloitte, has put out an inclusive environmental model that is very helpful to looking at the stages of the development that organizations are in. So if you're an inclusive leader, you've got to understand where your organization is. Is it inclusive, or does it need work? Where is it, and what are the key levers that you should be focused on in terms of trying to make improvement? And then the systems and relationships. Let's take systems for a moment. Why is inclusive leadership and systems important, and where are they connected?
Having the systems in place to support the work that you're trying to do ensures a level of sustainability for what it is you're trying to accomplish when it comes to D&I at your organization.
Having the systems in place to make sure you're accomplishing what it is you're trying to accomplish with the D&I strategy. And sometimes systems can be what? Not very inclusive, right? What is a system in an organization? Is talent management a system? Is recruiting a system? Have you seen some recruiting systems that are not very inclusive? What about development, mentoring? Have you seen that some people get mentored while others don't? Is the CEO, or are you as an inclusive leader being inclusive about the folks that you mentor? If you are the senior executive, who are you mentoring? Do you have a diverse set of folks that you're mentoring? Those kinds of things. If you are appointing people as an inclusive leader at the top to task forces, to problem-solving teams, to ideation-type activities, are the people you're appointing diverse? Are you being inclusive? And it's just not the typical forms of diversity, the traditional ones, race, gender, but it's people from different organizations, people from different functions, people who have been with the company at different points, some younger, maybe some older. But this is just one example of a way you need to really have some sort of a way to think about what is it that an inclusive leader needs to be competent about. Another point I'd like to make is inclusive leaders share or inspire a shared vision. We've talked about that, about, for example, the team, getting the team to rally behind you. Is that part of what we would call a shared vision? What is a shared vision? Yes?
The shared vision, I think, is where everybody has. A shared vision, I think, is where everybody has a seat at the table and is able to share and give input. And then you come up with a vision based on that in terms of the input or people's experiences.
Thank you. Any other comments about
I think
that?
there's a high level of alignment of leaders if it's a shared vision that you really.
High level of alignment?
I think a lot of times leaders think that they're aligned, and sometimes unless you get to that next level of assumptions and tease out some of those details on what the vision actually means, do they really reach kind of a more confident level of alignment.
I just put this quote here. I found this quote by Langston Hughes, very powerful quote. There is a dream in the land with its back against the wall. By mortal names and strains, sometimes the dream is called. There are those who claim that this dream was theirs alone, a sin for which we know they must atone. I mean, if you read that, it really speaks to this whole notion of inclusive leadership. Inclusive leaders possess the courage to risk. This is a picture of the dreamers, or and what does that say? I mean, when we say an inclusive leader possesses the courage to risk, what does that say? Any thoughts about the courage to risk? Yes.
So, when you were asking a question earlier about what's happening with the NFL and who's role modeling this, my boss actually brought it to our leadership team and asked to discuss it with our team. has nothing to do with the business I'm in. But she took a risk to say, we all know what's happening. It's heated. There's lots of headlines without the discussion below. So let's talk about it. And let's see what we as leaders can do within our organization and what parallels there are. Wow, that was a big risk for her to do that.
Stepping out of your comfort zone, right?
What company?
What company?
Nintendo.
Nintendo. Any other thoughts?
When I think about the dreamers, I think about their parents who came here and took their risk for a better life. And when I think about the dreamers also, it's them who show up and they go to protest, well knowing that they could be deported.
Thank you. Thank you. Any other thoughts? The courage to risk. Yes.
It's not the easy path. It's absolutely not the natural path that's sort of presented in front of you. So inherently, you're taking risks that you're cutting off sort of the easy access to success, to do a path that you're going to have to mostly sort of pave your own way.
Yeah, I was going to say I think that part of privilege and leadership is privilege. Is to share the burden, right? And that means that everyone who doesn't have your privilege is taking risks all the time, and you sort of to be an equal participant in it, you have to ante up as well, and be willing to be not just an ally but an accomplice in the change. And if you're not actually betting something real, then you're not really leading.
Thank you. And again, all of the, were you going to say?
Just one quick thing. I think one big risk is anytime you bring up something controversial, it may explode and the consequences might be different than what you expect, and it will take time to get that to a point where you can discuss a really emotionally energized issue. So that's a risk for a manager, but it's the right risk, in my opinion.
Okay, yes.
This is probably just adding on to what others have said, but the spirit of what's been said. But I think it's also, when I think of those people that are standing there, they all took a risk. It's the courage to stand up and go in a direction for which you may lose a lot. But it's the courage to stand for the right thing, even though you may lose your life even. Well, hopefully a CEO might lose their life, but others might lose their life on a journey to a better world, to a better place. And I think it's, exactly, that's your livelihood. So the courage to lose it all, to put it all on the table because you believe in a value, you believe in equality, you believe in inclusiveness.
Thank you. And the courage to lose, to risk it all. And Colin did that, did he not? I mean, he's an example of that. Even here locally, Michael Bennett, to some degree, you could characterize as did that. So institutional leaders, and as we speak of Colin, as we speak of Kaepernick, I thought it was appropriate to at least acknowledge, what he did in terms of standing up for injustice. And it wasn't about the flag or anything like that. It was about police brutality, and it was about injustices occurring in the disproportionate number of African Americans who were disproportionately impacted negatively by police actions and so forth. And so what you often find is inclusive leaders have to look at systems that are fairly status quo, that oftentimes work against people of color, women, and other dimensions of diversity. And so part of being an inclusive leader in the organization is really when you see an institutional practice, whether it's a recruiting practice, whether it's a development practice, whether it's even the way services are delivered, an inclusive leader speaks up, raises awareness, in some ways becomes a provocateur for inclusion. And so just want to talk about that. Any thoughts or any comments, reflections on institutional processes, systems, and practices? Any others that sometimes get overlooked? Yes.
Institutions most often choose leaders that do not challenge the system. So that's kind of how do you get that leader, or how do you become that leader in an organization that is encouraging, this is the way we do it, who's the best example of the way we do it, that becomes the leader or the leaders. So that, where's the impetus for changing that dynamic?
For changing that dynamic.
And getting to a different model where we're risk-taking and we are challenging our systems, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, it may be more or less difficult depending on how old your organization is and how big your organization is.
Yeah, how old your organization is, how big it is, and what types of mindset you have to change within the organization to move to a more inclusive culture. Exactly. Any other thoughts? Yes.
Well, I think that there's so kind of trying to noodle on that sentence, but I think that there's a lot to be said about institutional processes and systems, but really when it comes to challenging it, it really is about really trying to articulate the measurement, or really trying to kind of meet people or meet leadership where they are. Because we know, for example, diversity is good for business, or we know, for an example, that inclusive leaders make better leaders. So I think sometimes it's not even just about being risky or to potentially lose your job. It's about meeting your leaders where they are, and then to really try to craft the business case or try to measure and show where there may be opportunities for more improvement, more so than just kind of going in and throwing everything up in the air.
Right. I think that's an excellent point. It's really about building the business case, the organizational imperative for why D&I is important to the organization, and that's part of the role of the inclusive leader and the team that's driving it. George, did you have a?
I would say, in my experience, an integral part of the process was the presence of federal and state law that required the company to do certain things. I worked with people who worked in affirmative action. I worked with people in EEO, and that played a role in pushing the company in a certain direction. And without that requirement, I wonder if there would have been as much movement.
So I think that's a very important point. If you study the history of D&I today, it got its genesis in the 60s, perhaps, in terms of equal employment opportunity laws, and then later with affirmative action plans for federal contractors. And so that served as a basis for requiring organizations to have a more diverse organization based on demographics in the areas that they're serving. Today, what organizations, or those that have moved up the chain, have recognized that there is a value that goes beyond compliance. There's a value that goes beyond it's the right thing to do, to a value that says, there's a way to monetize the value of D&I to achieve organizational goals and outcomes and so forth. Because if you look at the demographic explosion, as one writer has written about it, the world is becoming much more diverse than it ever has been. And if you look at most major metropolitan areas in the U.S., they are currently majority, minority communities. And so the demographics are driving people to think about how they do business differently than what they've had to do in the past. Yes?
I have a question for you about
Sure.
that. I feel like now that diversity inclusion has almost become a trend or a fad, I love the fact that you talked about how it was birthed out of the 60s, where it was clear that it was about marginalized people. There was this great context of history. But now an organization can say they're diverse because it can actually be an all-white, male, straight organization, but they're diverse because they have diversity of thought, economics or what have you, or one's a Republican, one's a Democrat, they're all white, straight males. And same with inclusion, because they say that, hey, even though demographically in the historical context of what we looked at for diversity inclusion, they can say, hey, we're really inclusive because everybody here feels like they belong, but it's a homogenous organization. So somehow the term of diversity inclusion has become so diluted, kind of like now everybody's a leader. You walk your dog by yourself in the morning, you're a leader, and everybody gets a trophy. So there's something that's happened that's decontextualized the language, and you think about Deloitte, getting rid of ERGs that were for underrepresented groups because the white male leadership felt they weren't included. So there's something weird happening with the language that's becoming bastardized, so I would love your insight on how do you keep some purity to it.
Okay. Did you? Well, one of the
You can have, yeah.
one of the things that I'm doing a lot of research on today is a concept I call reversity. Steve knows that, and that in today's environment there is an equally compelling movement afoot in America, which is really designed to reverse, negate, outlaw efforts to create more diversity and inclusion in the country. And I would argue that some of the policies that we're seeing being developed and communicated out within Washington are just that. And so one of the things we're studying now is this concept of polarities, where you have those that are advocates for diversity and those who are advocates against it. And the question is, in this current disruptive period, where you've got both of these forces at play in America, how do you, as an inclusive leader, address those issues? And I would argue you have to be much more intentional about communicating your commitment to it as an organization. The leader has to really step up and really talk about controversial issues in a way they've not had to do before. And I would say there's a business case for why the owners in the NFL stood with their players. There's economic value there or loss. So I think part of it is to really to play offense, but also, and offense means looking forward, how to become more inclusive, but also being intentional about thinking about defense. What are the forces? What are the issues? Who are the people that are increasingly much more outspoken about why we shouldn't have diverse and inclusive organizations? Did you?
Yes. I think at the start of this session, you had asked us what words did we hear at the start of the panel and opening, and what words we didn't hear. And maybe I might have missed it, but I didn't hear the topic of, or the issue specifically about race. And so, even in this dialogue that we've been having, even with Colin Kaepernick's photo up there, and the topic of kneeling, we haven't really addressed the biggest elephant always in the room. And so we're using other form of code words to be inclusive, and I think that's good, and that's what we want. We want everyone's involvement and participation in this. But the big issue here is that the systems and the institutional racism that occurs in every organization, in every pyramid, that you see the workforce, is never addressed to flip that. And so it does take some courageous conversations for us to just talk about this. But this term has not come up from what I've heard, even among the panel, although we're implicitly stating it, but it's not necessarily addressing it.
And by being implicit, it allows it to be off the table.
Off the table.
Yeah, exactly.
I'll just put a plug in for our institute. Our next session, October 30th, will feature Mary Frances Winters, and her entire workshop will be on the issue of race, inequality, and so forth. So if you need more information on that, let me know. This is this is actually out of the document, the GDIB, these words, but inclusive leaders accept accountability to lead. What this says, basically, I'll just read you a little bit of it. It says, inclusive leaders hold leaders accountable, I think that's key, for implementing the organization's D&I strategy, its vision, its goals, achieving results, and being role models. This is what the benchmark would say you should do. They view the accomplishment of these goals as important and an important part of their responsibilities. And they publicly, as well as privately, internally and externally, communicate that support. They're seen as change agents, and they hold other leaders accountable for their results and so forth. So this is out of the benchmarking tool itself. Any thoughts? Any reaction to this? Yes.
not sure if I'm fully on this piece, but I will raise this. When we talk about the idea of inclusive leaders and the idea of accountability, what I keep wondering about is the idea of the language that we use. And what I mean by that is when something happens and someone does something in front of you, or they come and tell you, and I guess what I'm wondering about is what does it take and how do we get people to know what exactly they're seeing? There's big D and then there's little d. And I think that that is a piece, when we talk about people moving up and people of color moving up and why it doesn't happen, you've got a lot of little d that people just kind of pass on because we don't have language for it. And I wonder about that as I look at this and as I listen to this conversation.
Can you give some examples of like
Little d?
Oops.
I think I know, but I'd like.
Yeah,
I don't wanna
little
make
d,
assumptions.
little d is you're left out, you've been left out of the conversation and it's a mistake, but you're constantly left out of the conversation. So what is that? Is that someone who is forgetful? Or are you constantly being left out of the conversation because you're a woman or because you're a person of color? And if we don't have very many people of color on the level, what is that? And how do we talk about that? When we talk about going through implicit bias training, the issue really becomes, you can go through that training, but how do you recognize it and how do you model that, talk about that, and help people to begin to speak up and be able to lead in that way? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Sorry, I wonder how other folks are dealing with the challenge of what you're describing. Where, I mean, let's say best case scenario, and I've said this more than once, that, you know, intention doesn't mean there aren't implications for your behavior. And so when you think about a person who feels morally sound, and you tell them that their behaviors actually have implications, that they don't intend, but it's still there. How do you help create that safe space to say we all are doing things like that, so we're all going to be accountable for those behaviors, and more than just being accountable, we're going to say we're going to create a social contract to talk about that. Like, I'm invested, are we able to both be invested in that? I think that's the really difficult conversations that don't happen because they're darn hard.
Yeah, we've been working with a couple of clients here recently on that whole issue of significant differences and behavior and microaggressions or unconscious bias, whatever you might want to call it. And we use a tool called intent and impact. And it's a coaching process where when someone says something to you that you say, did that just happen to me? It's kind of like, how do you have a conversation with that person to say, you know, when you did this, it made me feel this way. What was your intent? And usually what we try to encourage people to do is to assume positive intent, that it wasn't really negatively impacted, but to have starting at the individual level, having that conversation about the feeling that you got from that interplay or that exchange. It's challenging when it's a supervisor, subordinate, or someone else in the organization, but what we're trying to get people to do is to practice that skill, to not just be silent or just let it go by, but to really in the moment, because the person oftentimes may not even realize that they offended you. And especially if you're working in a much more cross-culturally diverse organization. And Steve has a couple of comments.
Oh, no.
Oh, I thought you did.
I love what you just said there. I remember vividly a gentleman Maurice Ward, who worked with youth and trying to prevent them from going back into the jail systems. And he raised his hand one day and he says, you know, we lack cultural humility. And I think Terry spoke on it about having that learning opportunity. And I love what you just said. How do you create a safe space when there is a moment where you are offended, right? And it could be ignorance or it could be innocence. But I like what you said about, you know, taking that positive approach and having it to be where, all right, before I get angry and I get mad, let's talk about that. And Dr. Cheryl Ingram of Diverse City said something that was beautiful. Recently she posted an article about when you're asking someone to change their behavior, you're actually asking them to change their identity. And change like that takes a lot of time. So although it's a learning opportunity, there is got to be a follow or more. And that opportunity is where we have an opportunity to have the discussion. And a lot of times it's not that safe of a place. I remember going to Alaska. I remember going to Portland. And when I'm around these groups, and this is where you can all look up like groupthink, if you're in a locker room, especially when you're around men who use very masculine ways to measure one another up, and you can hear F-bombs, N-bombs being dropped because of what they feel they have been conditioned to be their norm, it's unsafe for me to have a moment to have them learn from me at that moment, because automatically there's an in-group, out-group bias that happens instantly. And so you also have to think about where you're at, the situation that you're in. And somebody else said you could lose your job on that. And so it does, I understand my own privilege as being an entrepreneur, that when I go on LinkedIn and I say something about Vulcan or Nintex, and I had a bad experience and traumatic, I know that's my privilege to voice that. And I always tell people, don't think that you have that same privilege. And I understand that you don't have that same privilege to say that. I have the privilege to say that. I understand that, and I'm willing to speak up on that. And that goes back to, are you willing to take risks and speak up for other people aside from your immediate circle? Not because I belong to the NAT group and because I want to speak up for fellow Asian people. It's because I actually want to speak up for fellow Black and brown people, and embracing saying that, right? And again, I have that privilege. Not everyone has that privilege, because you do have a mortgage, you do have kids, and so you got to be very careful who's around. And so again, it's a learning opportunity, but also make sure that you have the right armor in that situation. So, and this is just stuff that I learned from multiple people, so thank you.
Thanks, Dave. So I'm going to move us along a little bit. So we said a little bit about this. Inclusive leaders enable others to act. And I was struck by the official statement by the Seattle Seahawks this week regarding the situation. And this is what was written by the Seahawks on their website. It says, as a team, we have decided we will not participate in the national anthem. We will not stand for the injustice that has plagued people of color in this country. Out of love for our country and in honor of the sacrifices made on our behalf, we unite to oppose those that we would deny, that would deny our most basic freedoms. We remain committed in continuing to work towards equality and injustice for all. Seattle Seahawks. Is that an example of inclusive leadership?
Yeah.
What is it? Yeah.
I have a question about, now I don't know if this was people making excuses or what, but some people came out and said they were not sure if this was a mark against the military and the United States flag and the national anthem. And so I don't know if it was missed, the whole purpose of this was missed, or it wasn't communicated, and that in and of itself is an example of what talking about this incident. Well, you think this is what it was all about, but no, this is what it was really about. Do you hear what I'm saying?
Yes.
So some people felt that kneeling was anti-patriotic, anti-American flag, anti-national anthem, when in fact, I believe...
It was pro. I mean, I really
But no, some people have interpreted it that way, when in fact the intention was more this.
Right, right.
So talk about dialogue and having a safe environment to
And
discuss.
let's remember, in these disruptive times, there are those who would challenge any effort by groups such as this to do what they did to fight against injustice. So let's not gloss over that either, because it is real as well. But there are others too, I would say, that focused on the flag, some focused on the kneeling, some focused on the injustice. I mean, there's a whole lot of mixed signals that are going out there, and that's another part of the inclusive leadership's role. How do I navigate when you are getting these different commentaries about an issue? That if you look at the root cause of what it was all about, and you go back to what Colin, it wasn't about the flag, it wasn't about the military, it was about police, the injustice that police were betting on people of color, especially African Americans. And so, that, I'll just stop there. Someone had a comment, yeah.
I have a question, and that is, I think we were saying before, that sometimes leaders, they lead by example, but sometimes they forget to say why, what their example, why their actions are important to what, how it ties in with the strategy and so on and so forth. But in this case, we have the action of a whole team being absent from the field, which I completely support. They put out a statement, and that helps us understand. I guess I just want to, and I think you've already talked about intention, we talked about intentions, just how leaders can communicate more effectively to get their message out in an impactful way. I guess that's my question.
Well, I think it's being intentional, having a framework, thinking about it, having the conversation, and so forth. Just the issue of the teams, for example, not coming out for the flag. It was only in 2009, is that the year, when that became a requirement. Before 2009, I don't know if you know this, but professional football teams did not come out until after the national anthem was played. So that's just a recent occurrence. And part of the rationale, if you look at, was to support the recruitment of people into the military. And in fact, the military paid the National Football League a lot of money to allow them to do that. So I just want you to know the genesis of that. Yeah.
Just to go back to the comment over here about the message, I think that the progression of events is informative in that when Colin Kaepernick started doing it, he started as an individual at a time when he was very successful as a quarterback in the NFL. Over time, he continued to. He was sitting and then he was kneeling. He consciously chose to change in response to what some of his teammates said. Then he became less successful as a quarterback, and it became less of an issue because he was less successful. Now he's out of the league, and 2 weeks ago, there were only, I think, less than 25 athletes who did anything, either sat or knelt. And it's only because of the comments last weekend that you have this response. And if you, depending on which network you watch or which radio station you listen to, you are either given a lot of this information or you're given a lot of other kinds of information, and there's a whole package of outrage now that is being sold, and that you will hear repeatedly in the same vocabulary, and over the last week has become ever more vitriolic and actually disgusting. When the president talks about that you're somehow disrespecting the memory of soldiers who've had their arms and legs blown off in battle, that's we kind of reached the end of the line. But then that's repeated. So this is, the confusion about what this is about has been intentional.
Yeah.
And I know Ricky, this is a very hot topic, so there's one comment in the back.
Yeah, what I would say to that, to your comment, is that we have to remember that within this country, there is obviously a group of people that voted for this person in the very first place. They felt disenfranchised, they felt whatever it was that they felt. But the other piece to that is that while we look at this as something that is good for us, like we look at that and go, that's great, that's amazing. That whole entire other group look at that and go, oh my God, those treasonous. And that's because that's something that's prescribed to them. We've become a country that has become so divided, and a lot of it is because of our social media and what we choose to listen to and the groups that we choose to belong to.
Conversation and discourse, you had some very compelling presentations and conversation that you bring out from these. And we definitely want to get a chance to talk about some of that stuff.
It's nice meeting you both. Yeah.
Here in the back of the room, please take your seat.
I didn't know.
Please take your seat.